Most names in occult circles today echo through filtered religions and repackaged mythologies, but when we look deeper, far beyond the surface of symbolic demons or ritualistic fear, we arrive at a more terrifying reality. Ancient Sumerian spirits, raw and unrefined, entities that weren't summoned for power but survived despite protective spells etched into stone. These were spirits older than the concept of hell, born from human suffering and emotional chaos. And to the Sumerians, they weren't metaphorical, they were real. Chief among them were the Utukku, not mindless phantoms but conscious fragments of collective trauma forged in the residue of war, starvation and ritual abuse. They came in ranks, some latching onto the souls of individuals, others blanketing entire cities in darkness, feeding on unrest, creating order out of agony. These were spirits that didn't attack with claws. They attacked through behavior, influencing thoughts, quietly nudging people toward madness or conflict. Utukku weren't passive either. Some evolved, became physical. They took shapes from human fears, glowing eyes, monstrous hybrids, bodies of fire, and among them was Gallu, a solitary predator that waited in silence, striking sleeping victims by the neck, feeding not on flesh, but something far more essential. 7 of these spirits were said to be children of gods, exiled to deserts and ruins, each targeting a specific part of the body, the throat, the chest, the feet, like they followed some ancient anatomy of pain. But even these were not the worst. In the shadows of forgotten rituals lived Edimmu, spirits not of revenge, but of abandonment. Born from improper burials, these hollow forces entered lives through cracks, through unhealed grief and unspoken trauma, infiltrating the mind like parasites. They weren't seen, only felt, growing stronger in places where sorrow lingered and memories were buried. They could move between generations, attaching to families, waiting in emotional wounds for weakness, and the scariest part, they didn't possess, they didn't need to, they simply amplified what was already broken. These weren't malevolent demons, they were spiritual symptoms, consequences of neglect. But among all these figures, one towers in infamy, Lamashtu. Her myth persists not because of her appearance, lion-headed, clawed and winged, but because of her hunger. She didn't feed on war or revenge. She fed on innocence, on the bond between mother and child, snatching infants in silence, poisoning milk, stalking pregnancy. Lamashtu wasn't chaos, she was deliberate. Her methods were clear, and unlike demons that demand summoning, she simply appeared, feeding without permission. Protection against her wasn't through confrontation, it was deflection, invoking Pazuzu, the only spirit feared enough to drive her away. And here the terrifying parallel to Moloch emerges, not just in their hunger for children, but in how that hunger became institutionalized. Lamashtu was personal, Moloch became collective, turning that same hunger into ritual, into furnaces and drums, where the death of the innocent wasn't an accident, it was design. Some believe Lamashtu was the conceptual seed for what later became deities of sacrifice. And then there were the Gallu, the terrifying border guards of the Underworld, not spirits to control or bribe, but cosmic bounty hunters, whose only purpose was to retrieve souls that tried to cheat death. They weren't messengers, they were enforcers. They didn't tempt, they dragged, born from a culture that believed death itself had protocol. Gallu were the final punishment for the spiritually disobedient. If you broke the rules of the dead, they came for you. No exceptions. These spirits didn't need to be exaggerated or romanticized. Their horror was rooted in spiritual law, in the idea that even death has rules, and breaking them has consequences. And this is only the surface. The Sumerian world wasn't shaped by religion as we understand it, but by survival. Their magic wasn't to call on forces, it was to keep them at bay. Their spells weren't about empowerment, they were about protection. And when you look at it from that lens, the world they lived in becomes terrifyingly familiar. Because these spirits didn't die with the Sumerians. Their names may have changed, their rituals buried, but their patterns still here. In emotional breakdowns that don't respond to therapy. In generational curses that echo through bloodlines. In despair that spreads like fog across cities. We see them not as ancient deities, but as psychological disorders, as systems of suffering, as ideologies that glorify pain and division. But maybe, just maybe, those patterns aren't human at all. Maybe we didn't create them. Maybe they're feeding off us, just like they always have. But what if these spirits were never truly separate from us because they were us? Reflections of forgotten emotions, broken archetypes, etched into consciousness long before we learned how to speak of pain in rational terms. In the ancient Sumerian worldview, this was not poetry, it was survival, an understanding that the spirit world and the human mind were not divided but layered, intertwined, mirroring each other across dimensions. And within that mirroring existed entities like Pazuzu, perhaps one of the most misunderstood spirits of all. Unlike Lamashtu, whom he was said to oppose, Pazuzu was not a demon in the modern sense. He was a protector, but only when properly invoked, only when respected, only when feared. He was called upon to ward off worse spirits, to shield mothers and children from disease and misfortune, but this came at a cost. Because Pazuzu was not inherently good. He was chaos wielded with intention, a hurricane leashed to your command, and when not honored properly, he could turn on the very people who summoned him. His face, leonine jaws, bulging eyes, horned skull, wasn't meant to terrify you for spectacle, but to signal to the unseen world, this house is already protected by terror more ancient than yours. And that's the truth behind many Sumerian entities, their duality. They weren't cleanly split into good and evil. They were forces, raw and unfiltered, responding to the frequencies of intention. If your heart was deceptive, your offerings hollow, they would know. One such force was the Gallu demons, who didn't just drag souls to the underworld, that kept order in the spiritual ecosystem. Unlike Western images of hell, these enforcers weren't torturers, they were correctors, not out of malice but out of necessity. And their presence reminds us of a forgotten idea, that the underworld is not punishment, it is integration. That which is buried must still be reckoned with. The Sumerians did not fear hell, they feared being forgotten in it. Their worst fate was to die nameless, to dissolve into non-memory, to become a ghost with no story, no family, no tether. That's what the Edimmu and Utukku fed on. Disconnection, spiritual amnesia. That's why so many rituals revolved around naming the dead, feeding them, honoring their presence, because to be remembered was to remain real. And perhaps the most disturbing realization is that many of the protections in ancient magic were not built to ward off monsters. They were built to maintain identity in a world where forgetting who you are was the first step to being devoured. Even the gods weren't exempt. Some myths speak of divine beings falling into shadow, seduced by the very energies they once mastered. This is where the idea of reversal enters Sumerian esotericism. When protector becomes predator, when light collapses into decay, when what you once trusted begins to feed on you. It's not hard to see echoes of this in our world today. Systems that once protected the weak now exploit them. Structures that promised meaning now extract value. Leaders who once inspired now manipulate. These are not just political shifts, they are spiritual patterns, the very kinds that the Sumerians warned could birth new spirits, born not in the afterlife, but within the cracks of society itself. Egregores, group minds of trauma, built not through sorcery but through repetition. Repeated pain, repeated fear, repeated silence. That is how new Utukku are born. Not through summoning, but through suffering allowed to fester. And as these spirits gain shape, they do not emerge as horned beasts or winged monstrosities, but as ideas, as compulsions, as ideologies that glamorize cruelty and feed on division. The Sumerians would have recognized these patterns instant. They carved protections not just for the home, but for the mind. Spells that didn't just block spirits, but reminded the self who it was. Amulets weren't just charms, they were mirrors of identity. Words weren't just language, they were code, resonance, frequency. And that brings us to a chilling realization. The ancient world may have been mythic, but its insights were scientific in a way we've lost. They knew trauma changes structure. They knew names carry power. They knew forgetting invites corruption. They knew that spirits, once formed, do not vanish. They evolve. Some of them even merge, forming what were called Lamashtu, hybrid beings. Part man, part beast, protectors of sacred spaces. But even Lamashtu were not safe from inversion. In later myths, some were said to become inverted Lamashtu, protectors turned tormentors, guardians corrupted by misplaced worship, turning sacred space into prisons of doctrine. In this way, the Sumerians were not warning us about ghosts, they were warning us about systems, inner and outer, that when left unexamined become hosts for unseen forces. And so the real terror isn't the spirit in the shadows, it's the realization that maybe the spirit is the shadow, cast by parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. That maybe the most dangerous Sumerian spirits weren't lurking in tombs or deserts, but are waiting in the blind spots of our culture, our politics, our relationships, wherever we give away our power in the name of comfort or control. These spirits are not gone, they are not past, they are present, not just in haunted places, but in haunted people. Those who carry ancient echoes without knowing the source, those who feel drained and don't know why, those who've built lives around invisible wounds. The Sumerians wouldn't have called this psychology, they would have called it haunting. And they would have told you the cure wasn't exorcism but remembrance, to call yourself back, to reclaim your true name, to remember the patterns that make you who you are. Because in the end, the greatest protection isn't a charm or a chant, it's knowing what part of you is still alive, and what part of you might already be a spirit waiting to be named. If the spirits never left, if they evolved with us, then what does that say about the world we've built? A world where fear is monetized, where attention is a currency, where despair is packaged and sold like medicine. The Sumerians warned us, not by prophecy, but by pattern, that certain energies do not die, they cycle, adapt, embed themselves deeper into culture, technology, identity. In ancient times, you had to carve sigils in clay to protect your home. Now we carry the spirits with us in our devices, in the glow of screens that never sleep, in the algorithms that know our weaknesses better than we do. The Utukku were spirits of pain, born from collective trauma. What do we call that now? Generational curses, broken homes, chronic anxiety that spreads like mold through entire bloodlines. The Edimmu entered through emotional cracks. How many cracks are in a society built on performance, perfection, and suppression? We no longer perform rituals to bury the dead. We bury grief with productivity, with denial, with distraction. But spirits don't need rituals to survive, they need vulnerability, and we are drowning in it. Alu, the silent paralysis, may once have haunted the nights of Sumerians, but now it slips into our bedrooms through sleepless scrolling, dissociation, numbness. It doesn't sit on our chest, it lives behind our eyes. Lulu and Lilitu once stalked dreams and seduced from the shadows. Now they hide behind obsession, compulsive pleasure-seeking, fantasies that drain the soul instead of feeding it. What once was called possession is now explained as addiction, codependency, or spirals of self-destruction. No one can quite trace back to a source. But the Sumerians didn't try to name these things with clinical words. They gave them form so they could fight back, or at least recognize the enemy. Today we wear these spirits like masks, unaware they're not entirely our own. And there's more. There's always more. Beneath the known spirits, Utukku, Edimmu, Ilu, lie fragments of entities never given names, only described by what they unmake. These are the spirits that don't haunt individuals but infest ideologies, systems built around domination, despair, scarcity. These are their domains. They don't possess people. They possess movement. They don't whisper in ears. They write policies, start wars, turn gods into corporations, and rituals into commerce. In some hidden tablets, rare, unshared, mistranslated on purpose, there are references to the Nameless One, not gods, not demons, not even spirits, but ruptures in human consciousness that became self-aware. These were not born, they were remembered. Thought forms so ancient, they predate language, resurfacing when civilizations reach a certain threshold of power and decay. One such entity barely whispered in the ruins of Eridu was called She Who Reverses the Womb. Not because she harms children, but because she inverts the essence of creation itself. Where life should grow, she plants despair. Where joy should emerge, she births shame. Her presence is not marked by terror, but by the erosion of meaning itself. Her victims don't scream, they forget how to care. The Sumerians had no defense against her, only avoidance. She was never named direct, only signs were left. Symbols of the inverted tree, the broken seed, the crying river. And still she finds her way in. Another, even more elusive, was known only by a symbol, an open eye, bleeding soul. This spirit wasn't tied to death, desire, or dreams. It fed on truth, but only the kind humans aren't ready to hold. When it appeared, temples fell, oracles went mad, priests tore their own tongues out. This spirit didn't kill, it revealed, and revelation, as the Sumerians understood, is sometimes the most violent act of all. They called its influence the flooding without rain, a torrent of knowing that drowns instead of quench. In esoteric Sumerian magic, practitioners didn't seek to banish this spirit. They sought to contain its gaze. Masks of obsidian, sealed mirrors, rooms carved without angles. Even then, most failed. But the worst spirits weren't those that struck violently or quickly. The worst were patient, the worst waited. There's a line etched in faded Akkadian on a forgotten tablet now hidden in private collection. The quiet ones feed longest. These were spirits that did nothing but watch. For years, for lifetimes, their power wasn't in terror. It was in pattern recognition. They learned you. They adapted to your habits, your wounds, your deepest questions. And when the moment was right, they didn't enter. They answered, not with words, but with what felt like truth. That's how they took root. Not as invaders, but as insight, as revelations that no one else understood. The Sumerians called these spirits Lamashtu, the beloved lie. To be possessed by one wasn't to feel haunted, but to feel chosen, empowered, special. But over time your world collapsed inward. Friends distanced, joy soured. You became the priest of your own delusion, and the spirit, it merely observed as you built your own temple of ruin. There's a reason Sumerian exorcisms didn't always involve confrontation. Many involved mourning, because sometimes the spirit had replaced too much. You weren't being freed, you were being grieved. And what of the Gallu, the soul collectors of the underworld? We imagine them as monsters, but in truth they are laws, rules wrapped in shape. They don't chase, because they don't have to. Once your energy crosses a certain threshold of imbalance, they arrive like gravity, like consequence, and this too has modern reflections. Those who die full of rage and find no rest. Those who walk with curses born of old contracts. Those who can't forget what their blood remembers. These aren't metaphors, they're echoes. Echoes of the Gallu fulfilling duties, no longer recognized but still active. The dead, when ignored, don't always sleep. The tablets warned us, and yet the most terrifying line wasn't carved in fear, it was carved in understanding. It read, "The spirits did not come from the gods, they came from us, because that's the truth ancient magicians feared most. Not that we're prey to these entities, but that we are the source, that through our neglect, our cruelty, our refusal to face pain, we create them. Not with spells, but with avoidance. Not in temples, but in childhood, in silence, in violence, in denial. And the more we refuse to name them, the more power they gain. That's why the old rituals mattered. Not because they summoned or banished, but because they named, they acknowledged. They stared back into the dark, and in doing so, they reminded the human soul that it wasn't helpless, that there is power in recognition, that the first step to reclaiming sovereignty is knowing what you've surrendered it to. And perhaps that's what the Sumerians would want us to remember, that the real danger isn't being haunted, it's being unaware that you already are.